que se la tiene que follar soy yo, ¿eh?
Ahora, márchese.
The Spanish Civil War is more than just window dressing or just a backdrop in this film. Not so much because all of the major elements of the war are present in the film, because they're not. But to the extent that the film is about a conflict of values, Guillermo del Toro makes a real argument about what was at stake in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War breaks out in July 1936, on July 18th. And it breaks out as the result of a failed military coup. There is at that point a progressive, a leftist Popular Front government in Spain that was elected in February, and see it as their mission to turn Spain into a modern European nation, to wrest control away from the church and the big landowners, to take control of education, which was monopolized by the church, to resolve Spain's big illiteracy problem, a whole series of things to make Spain a better, a more just, a more democratic country. And a group of right-wing conservative military have plotted a coup to overthrow that government. And the coup is set off in the night of July 17, July 18th, 1936. The military think they can get control of the country in a couple of days' time, and that turns out not to be the case because they encounter unexpected resistance, mostly from the people themselves, the urban working classes and the peasants. And as a result, what would have been an easy military coup turns into a long, drawn-out civil conflict between two camps in Spain. The nationalists, these are the military, who were soon led by Francisco Franco, a fairly young general who had moved up through the ranks very quickly. And the Republicans, sometimes referred to as loyalists, because they were loyal to the democratically elected government of the Spanish Republic. The Spanish Civil War ends in April 1939 with a victory for the nationalists and a defeat for the Spanish Republic. And that results in an almost 40-year dictatorship by Francisco Franco, who dies in 1975. And only 2 or 3 years later, in the late 70s, does Spain again become a democracy.
El jabón te tiene que durar todo el año, ¿eh? Si no lo cuidas bien, se te castigará con 2 semanas de tareas extra.
The Devil's Backbone takes a very interesting and original look at the Spanish Civil War because it filters the whole history through the genre of the Gothic and of fantasy. And that does really add a very different dimension to what we're used to seeing in Spanish Civil War films. By limiting the story of the Spanish Civil War to what happens in this one orphanage, completely isolated from the rest of Spain, he gives himself a kind of freedom to think about the Spanish Civil War in a much deeper and more universal way than a filmmaker who would felt himself or herself to be bound to all the historical events, all the historical facts that happened between 1936 and 1939 in Spain.
Yo soy Galvez y él es búho. No habla nada, pero mira mucho.
Yo soy Carlos.
On the one hand, you have the children who represent self-reliance, solidarity, confidence, and Doña Carmen and Dr. Casares, who represent commitment to a cause and a kind of worldview that believes in the basic goodness of people and in science versus superstition or religion. On the other hand, you have Jacinto, who only believes in force, whose violent streak clearly comes out of his own traumatic childhood, himself being an orphan, and his fear and insecurity. If you really think about the origins of fascism, the origins of racism, the origins of the genocide, it is really fear and insecurity and wanting to destroy what you don't know, what you don't understand, wanting to destroy what's other, what's different. And the way in which Jacinto kills what he loves most, which is Conchita, for the sake of honor and not losing face, shows really clearly what fascism is about. It's a morally perverse honor because it's the honor of the right of the strongest, the honor to do whatever he wants to do because he believes that he is entitled to it. Jacinto's physical beauty and strength, and especially his own self-awareness of his beauty and strength, and his pride in his virile, macho presence. You can definitely link it to the cult of the body under fascism. And the same goes, conversely, for the fact that Doña Carmen and Dr. Casares and the boys all have physical defects. They are impotent, or they miss part of their body, or they're physically immature. And the boys are also not morally perfect.
Venga, quítamelo. Venga.
They bully each other, they have hidden agendas, they cheat, and yet between them, Dr. Casares, Doña Carmen, and the boys, through kind of basic solidarity and a basic belief in the need to help each other out, to be there for each other, and to take charge when it really matters. Being aware of flaws, being a flawed human being, is the only way you can be a good human being. And nobody can be a perfect human being. The people that believe they are perfect have lost all their self-defenses when it comes to confronting evil or not succumbing to evil. Del Toro complicates the very simple fairy tale division between good and evil. Santi, who in principle would seem the threatening, the scary, the part of the evil, is in fact representing good. Whereas Jacinto, who is a good-looking, strong, young fellow, is in fact the epitome of evil. So there's a way in which Del Toro complicates good and bad by associating the good with the ugly and the bad with the beautiful. There's another way in which the Gothic as a genre allows Del Toro to say something very profound about the Spanish Civil War, and more in general about civil violence. That Santi is an innocent victim. He's a boy, he has nothing done wrong, and he is killed. And the genre of the Gothic, because it focuses on the presence of ghosts that are traces of something that's unsettled, allows Del Toro to say something about the legacy that a civil conflict like the Spanish War leaves. This notion that something happened in the past that haunts us and that seeks some form of resolution. If you think about when the movie is made, it is exactly at the time when in Spain, ghosts of the Civil War start coming back. This is about 25 years after the transition to democracy, when groups of citizens start asking questions about the thousands of mass graves that are still littering the country, and start digging up skeletons of innocent people violently killed in 1936 and 1937. So the notion of the Civil War leaving a legacy that is like a haunting ghost that needs to be confronted, needs to be given a place, is very pertinent to the moment when the film comes out, and still today. The Spanish Civil War is the first major war covered by the visual media, by photographers and filmmakers who now have portable equipment that they can use to film at the front line, to film real battle action. In that sense, the Spanish Civil War was new. The Spanish Civil War was also new in the way that war was being waged. World War I was a war between professional soldiers, for the most part. In the Spanish Civil War, civilians are constantly targeted, and that was new. And one of the ways civilians were targeted was through aerial bombing. There's no doubt in my mind that the central presence of the bomb in The Devil's Backbone is a reference to the impact of city bombing as the main means by which innocent civilians were being killed in the Spanish Civil War. Anybody who is slightly familiar with the images that were produced as a result of the Spanish Civil War and the use to which these images were put cannot help associating the image of Santi with the images that were circulated of dead children during the Spanish Civil War. And they're remarkably similar to Santi's image. The look of a broken porcelain doll, the crushed skull, the hollow eyes, is modeled on these images of Republican victims. The outbreak of the Civil War split the country in two clearly defined parts geographically. And some things ended up in the hands of the nationalists. One of those was the mines in the South, for example, important mineral mines. Other things ended up in the hands of the Republicans. One of those was the National Bank and Spain's gold reserve.
No puedo guardarlo más.
The Spanish Republican authorities decided to use that gold strategically, and they especially used it to buy arms from the Soviet Union. In that sense, there's a real mythology around the notion of the Republican gold, which you see appear as these bars of gold that Doña Carmen holds in the safe, and later on in her prosthetic leg. Doña Carmen, she has been left behind in some way by her husband who died, and she has inherited his political legacy. She embraces wholeheartedly. He talks about the cause she is committed to, but she's also a little bit frustrated with having inherited that legacy because now she's left with no resources, all these kids to take care of, and she sort of makes do.
Vamos.
You can think of her as those who were left behind in Republican Spain when the Republican leadership left the country toward the end of the war, leaving others to fend for themselves. The ending of the film, the bad guy is dead, the ghost has gotten what he wanted, and the boys leave the place where all the bad things happened and walk into the empty countryside. We all know that this is the beginning of a 40-year dictatorship in Spain, so it's very strange to interpret that ending as a happy ending, or even as a resolved ending, because it's not an ending, it's only a beginning of many years of repression and suffering. So one way to think of the ending is it's the constellation of fantasy. Fantasy is in part about escaping from the tragic ending of actual history and compensating for that through some kind of symbolic way, through storytelling, and that's what, in part, what the movie does. On the other hand, you can think of the boys as the Spanish people that have been decimated in a way. They've lost many people. Their leadership is gone. Doña Carmen and Dr. Casares are dead. Ayala is dead. They're on their own, and they have to survive. And if you see they're leaving the orphanage and entering the desert, basically, as some kind of the beginning of a long journey through the desert that will lead finally, eventually, to some kind of happy ending, then that makes sense historically, because in late 1970s, when these boys would have been in their 50s or 60s, the happy ending was finally there. I think the reason that Guillermo del Toro is interested in the Spanish Civil War, and the reason why we should still be interested in his movies about the Spanish Civil War, have to do with the fact that what was at stake in the Spanish Civil War is still at stake today in many struggles.